Hi, good morning. My name is David Schenker. I'm a senior fellow and director of the program on Arab politics here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm pleased today that you're joining us for this special policy forum assessing the military campaign against the Houthis. I'd venture to say that even if you don't read the Atlantic magazine and haven't been following closely the developments in Yemen and the Red Sea, many of us know a lot more about the Houthis today than we did before the most recent news cycle. The last few weeks have been quite eventful, and there are significant attendant implications for these developments for U.S. policy and the global economy and the U.S. military footprint in the Middle East. The latest U.S. series of military strikes from an administration that has articulated an interest in decreased involvement in the region are noteworthy, to say the least. And all this comes as the United States and Iran move closer to either negotiations or potentially military confrontation over the clerical regime's nuclear program. For those of you who haven't been following, here's a brief timeline of the latest events. On March 8th, the Houthis threatened to resume attacks on shipping and to resume missile attacks on Israel in 4 days if Israel didn't end its embargo on humanitarian supplies to Gaza. On March 15th, the U.S. resumed its military campaign against the Houthis. That was featured in the Atlantic story. On March 18th, Israel resumed its war against Hamas militarily. And by March 23rd, the Houthis had fired missiles at Israel on 5 occasions, all of which were reportedly intercepted. On March 26th, the U.S. again targeted the Houthis militarily, and this morning, the Houthis fired 2 more missiles at Ben Gurion Airport in Israel. So where are we going? And how did we get here? Secretary Rubio says the purpose of the U.S. military campaign is, quote unquote, to get rid of these guys. Secretary of Defense Hegseth says the purpose of the military campaign is to ensure freedom of navigation and to reestablish deterrence. Can any of this be accomplished? What are the assets the United States is bringing to bear in the Red Sea? Can or will the U.S. campaign be sustained? Does the U.S. have sufficient granular intelligence to degrade, dismantle, or dislodge the Houthis from power in Yemen? Is the new FTO, the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation, or should I say redesignation of the Houthis as an FTO after President Biden lifted the designation, having an impact on the Houthis? What is the impact on global shipping and on inflation globally? How is the effective closure of Bab el-Mandeb impacting the United States, Europe, Egypt, and other Arab allies? In this campaign, does the United States have partners? Are allies cooperating in terms of intelligence collection or otherwise militarily? Are Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates assisting? And finally, but perhaps most importantly, what is the U.S. strategy in Yemen? Does the U.S. have a Yemen strategy? There's so much to discuss, and I'm pleased that we have an excellent panel today to address these questions, including my colleagues, Michael Knights, the Institute's Bernstein Senior Fellow and creator of its Militia Spotlight platform, which offers in-depth analysis of Iran-backed militias in Iraq. Noam Raidan, a Senior Fellow of the Institute and co-creator of its interactive maritime attack tracker and maritime spotlight platform, which provides comprehensive details and analysis on incidents in the Red Sea and other regional waterways. And last but not least, Elizabeth Dent, a senior fellow at the Institute, former director of the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula at the Pentagon, and a former policy advisor at State Department, the State Department's special presidential envoy to the global coalition to defeat ISIS. As always, If you'd like to ask questions of our panelists during the event, please enter them into the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you're watching this policy forum on our website or YouTube, feel free to email your questions to policyforum, one word, at washingtoninstitute.org. I don't know if Michael Knights is out there yet. If not, please, let's start with Elizabeth Dent. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And thank you everyone for joining us. Obviously, this is not a new problem set that we're dealing with. The Houthi actions have threatened international trade, disrupted maritime security, contributed to broader regional instability. The U.S. government, I'm going to talk about the U.S. government strategy across the Biden and the Trump administration a little bit. The U.S. government has viewed the Houthis as a direct threat to U.S. interests, to its allies, the international order that ensures these safe, open sea lanes for international commerce. That theme has stayed the same across both the Biden and Trump administrations. For the Biden administration's part, prior to the October 7th attack, his approach really was largely framed around restoring U.S. commitment to multilateral diplomacy and ensuring the freedom of navigation. Now, that was a part of the national defense strategy as well as part of the national security strategy. A lot of this work centered around exploring emerging technologies that could take the place of sailors out in the maritime arena to help monitor these strategic choke points, critical shipping lanes. A lot of that was being done, and it's still being done by Task Force 59 at U.S. Naval Central Command, alongside of our international partners, and then working to integrate those partners at sea. The international diplomatic engagement approach really did not change when the Houthis began attacking the shipping lanes. The Biden team was very focused on establishing international coalitions, since they saw this as an international problem, coupled alongside of military measures at a later date. Just to go through the Biden team's strategy here, about a month after the Houthis began attacking commercial vessels, Secretary of Defense at the time, Lloyd Austin, hosted a Red Sea security ministerial with, I believe it was over 45 to 50 different international partners, and announced the creation of a defensive coalition called Operation Prosperity Guardian, which would operate under the combined maritime forces in Manama, Bahrain, led by the United States. The Biden team also worked to leverage the United Nations and other international organizations to try to curb Houthi resupply lines and increased interdictions of maritime resupply vessels. A few weeks after it announced this launch of the defensive coalition, after the Houthis conducted a couple of major attacks against American warships and UK warships, the US and UK jointly launched strikes in Houthi-controlled areas of Western Yemen, alongside of Australia, Bahrain, Canada, Denmark, the Netherlands, and New Zealand, which all provided what they deemed non-operational support. For a few months, those strikes continued, but largely became more unilateral US strikes later in the year, the majority of which were called self-defense strikes. Targets included mostly Houthi military assets, weapons storage and production facilities, command and control centers, radar sites, things like that. The Biden team continued to work, look for additional ways to more effectively disable Houthi capabilities, because as we know, the attacks did not stop. And they were working on a more developed plan, including persona targets, but they ran out of time, and they provided that information to the Trump administration. As we know, none of those efforts, again, resulted in the Houthis halting the attacks. That really didn't happen until the Israel-Gaza ceasefire was announced and went into effect earlier this year. Once President Trump took office, it was clear that the Houthi threat was a pretty high priority for him. As David has already mentioned, he signed an executive order redesignating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization within about 2 days of taking office. And then subsequently, a few months later, announced this new military campaign fairly quickly after the Houthis shot at some American aircraft and downed an MQ-9 Reaper drone. And of course, when the Houthis began threatening shipping lanes again, when the Israel-Hamas ceasefire broke down. So I think we can characterize the Trump administration's approach thus far as decisive, forceful, and direct military action. But no campaign comes together in just a few short weeks or even a few short months. The campaign that's being implemented right now is a direct result of focused efforts by the military and intelligence communities for well over a year to better understand Houthi capabilities and political and military networks. Another stark difference, I think, is President Trump as a contrast to President Biden, who largely worked through regional partners to discourage Iran from resupplying the Houthis. President Trump has been very open about the fact that his administration will view any shot from the Houthis as a direct shot from Iran. This is a very significant and public pressure on Iran that he has been very open about. Again, we're only 12 days into this new military campaign, but I think it's different from the Biden approach in a few critical ways. The first being the expansion of targets beyond infrastructure to include persona. And I think that we can assume that the Trump administration is willing to continue going up the chain of Houthi officials at this time. We haven't seen any indication that they are planning to stop that. The second is that this is a more sustained military campaign, whereas with the Biden administration, we were seeing strikes, once every few weeks or so. And the reason that it is a more sustained military campaign is largely because the third point, the delegation of authority for initiating those strikes has been passed down to the combatant commander, General Kurilla, the commander of Central Command, who can control the timing and the tempo of these strikes now out in the field rather than having to send them back to Washington to be approved. We've also seen a pretty significant increase in military assets headed out to the region. So last week, Secretary Hegseth signed an order for another carrier strike group to head out to the region and has since sent additional assets to the Diego Garcia Air Base in the Indo-Pacific, likely to assist with this campaign and also to posture for any additional increase in hostilities in the region and ensure that that campaign can remain sustained because it needs additional assets to be able to rotate in. This level of commitment, I think it should be a signal to both our adversaries as well as our international partners that this is a very serious effort. But of course, the Trump team knows that military might alone cannot stop Houthi attacks. Campaign is likely going to need to be sustained at this intensity for several months in order to signal effective U.S. commitment to crippling the Houthis and producing more lasting changes on the ground, which produces two concerns. The first of which is, can we replenish our stockpiles fast enough to meet the demands of our own military as well as our partners who are purchasing stockpiles from us? And two, just whittling away at this stockpile for this mission set leave us vulnerable in other priority theaters. So again, I think that the Trump team will come to the conclusion that some of the efforts of the Biden administration will need to be implemented into this military campaign alongside of this maritime strategy, like introduction of vessels, as well as organizing contributions from partners and allies, which interestingly, despite President Trump's commitment to burden sharing, is not a part of this campaign. So again, we're a bit early, I think, to assess whether or not it's going to be successful, but certainly I think there are some pretty unique differences in approach here. And of course, the ultimate challenge for the U.S. is going to be effectively neutralizing this threat.
Thank you, Liz. Fascinating. It generates for me a number of questions, which I will ask you after we get through the other presentations. Mike Knights, welcome. It's good to have you. I want to hear from you about the nature of the attacks. Can you tell us?
Thanks very much for having me, David. Do you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, thanks. Sorry I was a minute or two late there. I'm calling from vacation. So, the first thing to say is it's kind of interesting that this is happening just as we pass 10-year mark of the war undertaken by the Houthis and the Gulf-backed coalition. Many of the things that are happening right now were happening 10 years ago, but it was a Saudi air campaign that was actually undertaking them. They were going, at that stage, they were working out what they could find, hitting what they could find, working out what they needed to find, and trying to hit that stuff. And it's interesting to watch us going through the same cycle. I think one of the things it says is, a lot more attention could have been put on the Houthis a lot longer ago. We didn't really need to be where we are right now in terms of what we understand about them. But there are priorities for ISR and intelligence and analysis, and they were not with the Houthis 10 years ago, or even for most of the 10 years since then. So when we look at what's happening at the moment, and we listen to some of the statements coming out of the administration, one way or another, we can tell that in early October, the administration understood that there was a risk the Houthis would go back to anti-shipping strikes in the Red Sea. In early March. But we could also see from a little statement made by Secretary of Defense Hegseth that the US was getting pretty tired of our drones getting shot down. I mean, it's over 15 Reaper type drones have gone down over Yemen. The Houthis are chewing through our fleet, and we sort of have to provide ISR over those areas. So it's not like we had an option. So I think part of what's happened here is about wanting to coerce the Houthis into backing down from a resumption of Red Sea attacks, which is kind of odd because honestly, I don't think they were really threatening a very serious interdiction of the Red Sea. So, that they were threatening to hit Israeli ships that aren't there, or the odd ship that they would say is Israeli that might be linked to the Israelis, but it's not really that much of a big deal, honestly. But then I think the drones thing was getting unsustainable too. It's an interesting counterpoint when you think back to 2020 when we didn't shoot back after one of our global hawks went down to the Iranians over the Gulf. Here we are in some ways trying to recreate a more permissible air environment for ourselves over Yemen, because a lot of the strikes we've seen have to some extent an air defense component. The Houthis have also tried to retaliate, of course, a number of times since we started this new phase of the air campaign, which grows out of Poseidon Archer, the sort of monthly US-UK strikes. This is definitely a different animal from those. Whereas we were doing those once a month in collaboration with the UK, we're doing them now every 2 days, 1.5 to 2 days, unilaterally. Also, at a much higher tempo, but this is not a high tempo air campaign. What this is, though, is maybe an actual air campaign. Stuff we've done with Poseidon Archer, stuff we've done with the self-defense strikes, you wouldn't characterize them as an air campaign, something that was planned, something that was maybe sequenced, something that had a lot of deliberate targets built into it, and then had a phase where you would go after emerging targets. I would identify 4 main target categories that we've seen since March 15th this year. One of them, which is new, is Houthi leadership. We have seen by the count of Ahmed al-Basha, who does excellent open source and multi-language sort of research on the Yemen war, around 15 Houthi flag officers, colonels, lieutenant colonels, or majors who have been announced as killed since March the 15th and have been buried, since then. Of course, burials happen quickly. So, we can maybe say, that there has been a degree of successful targeting of mid-level technicians and individuals who are associated with advanced conventional weapon storage facilities and headquarters. It doesn't look as if we've really got any serious national level leadership for the Houthis, but we're probably still trying. We've got 2 to 4 individuals who you would characterize as being part of the political and security establishment of the Houthis, not just their security establishment. We're going to keep going, but I tell you, it's extremely hard getting to these Houthi leaders. I think they've got better operational security than Nasrallah, and I think they don't have the Israelis looking at them from as close range. So that's going to be very hard. And what we're going to find is, just as it was with the Saudis, we're going to get drawn into urban areas, and we're going to end up with some serious collateral damage at some point. And the Houthis are going to try and make that happen as hard as they can. The second target set, which again is kind of different, is Sada, the Houthi home province and home city. A lot of the stuff being hit in Sada is deep buried underground advanced conventional weapon storage and manufacturing facilities, and we are really starting to get after them now. But we're also going into the cities to try and get at the leadership and some of their refuge locations. Just to differentiate it from what happened with the Saudis 10 years ago exactly, in May of 2015, the Saudis destroyed in a 10-day period 1,200 1,200 residential complexes in the Sada area as a collective punishment strategy against the Houthis. What we're doing now is nothing like that. It is about hunting down or trying to find where high-value individuals are. And then the third and fourth categories of stuff being struck in this campaign are Red Sea coast targets, including mobile radar and advanced conventional weapon storage. That's just more of the same of getting after the enemy's capability and reducing that. And then, interestingly, a fourth area, which is so far about 6 forward headquarters in peripheral areas, like the smaller provinces along the front lines with the federal government of Yemen, the internationally recognized government. There we've seen Houthi supervisors, junior commanders, and regime security personnel hit there, as well as sometimes finding an air defense system out there. So, just to finish off, how does one assess this? Well, Elizabeth's obviously right that we don't know how effective this stuff is because we just don't see the intelligence. Ultimately, there could either be a great big board, a spider web, a great multinodal analysis of Houthi leadership and advanced conventional weapon storage and movement facilities and who's an expert on what, and they're being X'd out one after the other. That's one option. The other option is we're just hitting what we can find, and it's a kind of trashy target list. And occasionally we hit something good, but mostly we're just hitting whatever we can find, which is very reminiscent of, for instance, Kosovo campaign, 72-day campaign back in 1999. You don't hit what you meant to find, you just hit what you can find. But we are going to disarm slowly. As long as we pair this with increased interdiction of Houthi rearmament from Iran and maybe threaten the Iranians and, make them think twice about sending stuff over, eventually we will wear down the Houthi advanced conventional weapon strike capability, and that will make ships safer in the Red Sea. Will shippers return to the Red Sea? No one will tell you that. But, the problem is the Houthis have reshaped global shipping in a way that is more profitable for global shipping companies. So, who knows if that will change. I think on coercion, though, if we're trying to coerce these Houthis into publicly saying we're not going to attack ships in the Red Sea anymore, we have almost zero chance of doing that. These guys are completely brutalized and desensitized after 20 years of war against Western equipped militaries. And they can also tell with the foreign terrorist organization implementation and with the creep towards arming and equipping some of the Yemeni armed forces facing the Houthis, that they're facing a really serious chokehold coming. And so I don't see how we can coerce them really with this level of violence. They eat this for breakfast all day long. The thing that they're going to do next is to strike out Saudi Arabia as our weak point. And so how well we protect Saudi, can we protect them as well as Israel was protected twice last year, is going to be absolutely critical. Because if we do protect the Saudis as well as Israel was protected or better, in some ways we're going to call the Houthis bluff there. And that's going to be a very important strategic win for the West, the anti-Houthi coalition, and for the Saudi-US relationship, if that happens. I'll pass over there. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, a lot of interesting points there. Certainly, the last one about the Houthis sort of remaining points of leverage being Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So we got from you the campaign, the target set. We got from from Liz, sort of the defense Department approach, what they're putting in the area and the AOR, from Noam, perhaps the untold story, shipping. We hear about it a little bit, but we don't see every day these ships. We hear about them. We get some inflation. Give us a story.
Thank you very much, David. Liz, Mike, thank you so much for the sharp insights you shared. Corey, how about we go to the map we at the Washington Institute have been building for over a year now. To the viewers who are with us today and don't know what we have been doing at the Institute, what you see here is a map where we track maritime attacks in the Middle East since 2019. And these include the Houthi attacks. So we don't only focus on what's happening now, but we also have data on what's been going on in the region over the past few years. And if we scroll down, Corey, a little bit, you can see on this map, if we zoom out a little bit, please, what you see on this map are all the attacks we've tracked so far since 2019. And today, specifically, we're going to be discussing the Houthi, of course, attacks, because this is the subject of today's webinar. So how about, Corey, we go to the slides, please. And before I start, I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Farzin Nadimi, who created the map with me. So I'm going to be talking about the Houthi threat to freedom of navigation. Let's move to slide 2. I'm going to be addressing 3 questions today. What is the current state of commercial shipping in the Southern Red Sea and Gulf of Aden? And what are the implications for safe navigation? 2, what's the status of Russia and China-associated commercial vessels in the Southern Red Sea compared to other operators? And 3, a very important question, which probably Mike also touched on, what would a persistent Houthi maritime threat, how would a persistent Houthi maritime threat affect U.S. regional partners? And here I'm talking about energy and maritime trade plans. Let's start with slide 3, please, now. What you see here is a chart that shows all the confirmed attacks we have recorded between November 2023 and December 2024 against commercial ships, and the impact this has had on the transit of ships in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Using various weapons, the Houthis have conducted over 100 attacks against commercial ships and warships since November 2023, announcing new shipping restrictions at every stage or phase of their maritime campaign. The weapons have included aerial drones. They've included also anti-ship ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, and unmanned surface vehicles. The Houthi announcement in January 2025 to halt attacks against what they call non-Israeli vessels was met, of course, with doubt. Several shipping companies and insurance companies were rightfully cautious. In March, just this month, the Yemeni group announced a resumption in attacks against what it labels Israeli ships. But the Houthis, of course, have shown little willingness or even ability to accurately distinguish between the ships they target. They have inaccurately slapped the Israeli, US, and UK label on certain vessels that had no links to these countries. The Houthis have made it clear they are ready to resume their military activities if the Gaza truce falters and if the US and British militaries strike additional targets in the Houthi-controlled parts of Yemen. And this is what we're seeing right now, a resumption in Houthi military operations. Now, the question is, what's the situation now in Bab el-Mandeb? And here I'm referring to the transit. This takes me to slide 4, please. What you are seeing on this slide, focus on the gray line. I don't want you to be confused here. The gray line shows you the transit right now this year, compared with the orange, which starts from late 2023 up until 2024, and compare them all with the blue line, which shows us how the transit was in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait way before the Houthi maritime campaign. You can clearly see that the transit in Bab el-Mandeb up so far remains very depressed compared to transits over the past years. Let's move to the next slide, please. So now, post-Gaza ceasefire in January 2025, the Houthis announced that they were going to halt their military activities. Some ship owners, operators did test out the Southern Red Sea route, but only a small number of ships appear to have returned from the Cape of Good Hope. More oil tankers were recorded shipping diesel and jet fuel from India to European market, taking advantage of the temporary lower insurance rates. Giant shipping companies, meanwhile, like Maersk and MSC, haven't changed their plans. They're not coming back for now. And finally, Russia and China, which linked ships, which I will be focusing on in a bit, remain the key users of this route at the time when US flagged, UK flagged, or any ships affiliated with these two countries, as well as those affiliated with Israel, are unable to transit the region just because the Houthis have decided that they are the authority that decides what ship transits this important choke point to global trade. On the Russia and China linked ships, I would like to show you slide 6, please. How are Chinese or China linked vessels and even Russia linked vessels behaving in the region? What you see here is data a ship transmits. If you look at these circles I have there, they show you Chinese crew, Russia cargo on board crew, all crew Chinese, etc. What these ships are doing, they are putting, instead of their AIS destination, they are putting information that shows that they are carrying either a Russian cargo or Chinese cargo, or have Russian or Chinese crew on board, in a clear sign to the Houthis that they are linked to Russia and China, and so that they can have a safe passage. Do others behave like that? I've seen a few other ships, but mostly this has been, for me, I've seen China and Russia linked vessels doing this more than others. On the issue of Russia linked ships, I would like to move to the next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about Russian crude flows through Suez Canal, Red Sea. To those who don't know, Russian crude flows through Suez Canal and the Red Sea have been the least affected cargo or commodity by the maritime attacks that have been taking place in the region because of the Houthis. And this is according to data analytics platform like Kepler. What you see here is Russia's exports to India through the Red Sea and Suez Canal. If you look at 2023 and 2024, you won't see a change. In fact, what's happening, the average last year in 2024 was around 1.6 thousand barrels per day, compared to 1.5 thousand barrels per day in 2023, meaning that more Russian crude was flowing in the region during the Houthi maritime campaign. So I wanted to show you this just to give you an idea of how China and Russia-linked vessels are operating in the region when many other countries are unable to transit through those important choke points. Now we move to the final slide, please. I would like to discuss briefly the impact on regional oil flows from Saudi Arabia here. And according to data from Maritime data analytics platforms, we haven't seen flows from Saudi Arabia affected. And the country also has its east-west pipeline you see on the map, which can be used to avoid sending oil through Bab el-Mandeb if the kingdom wanted to do so. So it has alternatives, unlike other countries in the region, specifically Iraq, by the way. To those who don't know, data clearly shows that a large volume of Iraqi crude shipped from Basra in the Persian Gulf has been going around the Cape of Good Hope to reach Europe. And this is because of the risks European buyers are dealing with in the Red Sea. Now, in addition to regional oil flows, I want to highlight here that the Houthi ship attacks and the Houthi threat in general pose a longer-term challenge to regional security and trade plans if they are not effectively addressed by concerned parties. Among the key questions to ask here, how would the persistent maritime threat affect US regional partners, some of whom have been planning to drive trade growth before the Houthi maritime campaign by becoming global logistics hubs? And can they still leverage their strategic location between three continents if those continents remain partially disconnected by the Houthi attacks, which are keeping the Red Sea a high-risk region for shipping? I'm going to end the slides here, please, and just briefly summarize. If the Houthis continue to grow their military arsenal with the support of Iran, of course, and if they continue to decide which ships are allowed to transit the region, then the US, Saudi Arabia, and other partners may need to prepare for the emboldened group to exert its newfound leverage in other ways beyond the Gaza war. given the effectiveness of their maritime campaign in causing deep logistical disruptions for shipping. Thank you very much, Schenker, and let's go to questions.
Thank you, Noam. Amazing the slide with the crew sort of signaling to the Houthis what ships to hit and what not. Listen, many questions here. I've got some coming in online. I'm going to start out with a few. To Liz, starting off. So you raised, I think, a very important point when you talk about sustainability of the campaign, whether we can replenish our munitions, how fast are we burning through, and so on this question, I would say that you asked the question, but you didn't give the answer, which is where are we going to, if we continue at this rate, if we sustain this campaign, are we not going to be able to replenish? Are we going to have to take from other stocks? And what of our partners, if we had partners in this initiative, could help fill the gap?
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, it's a difficult question to answer. Our stocks are already pretty depleted because of the war in Ukraine. We've not only been donating a lot of that from ourselves, but also encouraging other partners to donate their military support. And then, of course, a lot of our material has gone to Israel. So, I think that we were already depleted. Now, the last couple of years, I do believe the defense industry has been working to help replenish those stockpiles. But look, it may not be fast enough. And it is very likely that this administration will have to pull from other priority theaters, potentially from other combatant commands, in order to ensure that CENTCOM has the munitions that they need to sustain this fight. So I think the problem with trying to answer it right now is that we just don't know for sure. But certainly it is taking a cut into the stockpiles. In terms of gaps that our international partners can fill, what we saw during the Biden administration was that there was I don't want to call it a competing defensive coalition, but an alternative defensive coalition that the European Union countries started called Operation Houthis. And I think, we did have an international coalition that the U.S. was leading that was also another defensive coalition. But I think that we haven't seen as much of an appetite from a lot of partners. Now, whether or not there's leverage that the Trump administration can utilize that the Biden administration did not in order to ask partners to contribute more, I think that is a question that can be answered quite easily. But it's just not something that we've seen them have an appetite for. But certainly there are gaps that our both European partners as well as regional partners could help fill to ensure that the burden for all of this does not just come down to the United States.
Thanks. Mike, let me ask you, you spoke briefly about interdictions of weapons to the Houthis. We saw over the past couple months reports of interdictions by the Yemeni government, the legitimate government, and others. So what would this take, first of all, to really torque the pressure? And second, sort of unrelated, but when we talk about pressure, one thing that you didn't talk about was what can be done on the ground. Do we have other potential partners like the Southern Transitional Council, the legitimate Yemen government that isn't done with its own civil war against the Houthis right now? What should we be doing about that, if anything? Is there an opportunity here?
Got it. Two great questions. On the interdiction side, we know that the best a range of coalition navies could do was not good enough for years on end, including the United Nations and its UNVIM effort, the Gulf navies, now more recently European and US navies combined. Why is that? It's because of permissions. It's because of the mode in which the weapons come in. They come in small vessels that are hard to detect against the mass of other small vessels, shipping vessels, small fishing boats, dhows. So they're either on a flagged vessel that we can't get out for legal reasons, or they're just spread out amongst hundreds of identical looking smaller vessels after multiple layers of ship to ship transfers. There's no way around this except to change the rules of engagement, gain greater granularity on targeting, or affect the upstream supplier, Iran. Get into the areas where they're doing ship to ship transfers. And what I would suspect, without any knowledge of it, is that we have a naval special warfare campaign going on right now that did not exist maybe 6 months ago, and that it works with partner forces in Yemen to tighten up control of the Yemeni coastline. The obvious way to interdict the Houthis from using the Red Sea coastline is to remove them from the Red Sea coastline. And that's what I'll talk about next. But, it's important to remember too that one of the upstream parts of this process is Oman. Oman is where a great deal of interesting components come through that land border between Oman and Yemen through traditional smuggling networks. Other stuff comes in through Yemeni government-controlled ports, including in southeastern Yemen, and then gets moved by land smuggling networks into the Houthi areas right across the front lines. So, you've got to be able to get at the direct maritime supply to the Houthis, but also the Oman and also the southern Yemen aspects of it. And it requires a lot more focus than it's had in previous years. I think last year, even though we were hitting a lot of interesting stuff over there, the enemy was probably resupplying faster than we were destroying. So we were on a net loser. We're turning that around by attacking manufacturing, by attacking stocks of weapon systems, and probably by tightening the interdiction a bit. But ultimately, whether it's coercion of the Houthis or whether it's simply taking away their capabilities to attack shipping, threatening or undertaking the liberation of the Red Sea coastline, and I sound like a broken record, is the key thing you need to be doing. The Houthis only fear one thing, I think. I've spent many years looking at them, studying numerous West Point Combating Terrorism Center articles, 2 books into a 3-book trilogy about them. The only thing they fear is the loss of control of terrain and populations, and particularly the Red Sea coast, which is their window to the world, their only window to the world. And it's the only thing that has got them to the peace table in a semi-serious way. And then we messed it up and we didn't follow through with the Stockholm agreement provisions, but at least it got them there. So threatening to create an offensive ground force structure, particularly on the Red Sea coast, as well as potentially on some other battlefields. And it works better if you can threaten a Red Sea coast advance at the same time as you're bringing pressure on them on other battlefields at the same time, so they can't just switch their reserves around. If you were to combine a more aggressive US aerial posture with a by, with, and through development of ground forces, some of which are already reasonably capable, and maybe roll a little bit of quiet help from some Gulf states who have a lot of experience of arming and equipping these forces into the effort.
You're talking about the Emiratis?
Yes, all those things put together could help. And they would either do one or two things. Either you start to take the terrain off the Houthis, and they would have less ability to use their slower and shorter range weapon systems like drones and cruise missiles. They'd have less ability to take surveillance drones out from the ports, from the coastal areas. They would have less ability to use the coastal mountain massif looking out into the sea for their surveillance stuff. But they'd also, literally lose almost all capability to use unmanned surface vehicles, mines, unmanned underwater vehicles, fast attack craft, all of that stuff will be gone straight away, which would be a massive improvement.
Thanks. Liz, you got anything to say about that? Nothing.
You need you need authorities, though, as Liz is going to say.
Yeah, no. Noam, let me ask you. First of all, maybe three short questions. One is the Houthis are demonstrating some I don't know, empathy, sympathy, support for Russian Chinese shipping. Is this a quid pro quo? There had been reports about certain weapon systems sent to the Houthis in return for this, or even the tolls being paid by Chinese shipping in the Red Sea. Obviously, the Chinese have no issue with paying the Houthis. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Second, is it possible, in the absence of real European naval deployments, that the Europeans have gotten used to this? What has been the economic cost to the Europeans of the closure? Can they live with this? And finally, what would it take for shipping to resume? Or are we going to ever see that? Or is this a new reality that we can learn to live with the Houthis and without Baba Mandeb?
Well, excellent questions. You already know you're a terrific moderator, David. These are very good questions. So let's go one by one. Russia, China ships. Well said, David. You referred to previous reports. Last year, around February, March, we did see reports. I remember Bloomberg mentioned something about China, Russia reaching an understanding with the Houthis to allow safe passage to their ships. Based on the data we see, and which I displayed earlier in my presentation, it's clear that there's something there. There is probably direct communication with them. What I can say at least is that the data that I'm seeing, the data that I'm using for my analysis points in that direction, that there could be communication between Russia and China. And I showed how some ships behave, especially with their AS destination. With respect to the issue of tolls, we did see reports on that. I myself cannot confirm it, and I would saying that, but I don't have more to add. A European defensive mission in the region, EU NAVFOR Aspidis, what they've been doing since February 2024, they've been escorting commercial ships in the region, meaning if a ship wants to pass through Bab el-Mandeb, they can reach out to the defensive mission and ask for escort. And what we know from our own research, this has been happening, and a number of ships have been requesting escort from the EU defensive mission. Now, I mentioned earlier transportation costs with respect to, let's say, crude oil that is being shipped from Iraq's Basra. Transportation costs, of course, are going to be way higher, probably around like $2 per barrel if the shippers are shipping from Basra and going around the Cape of Good Hope to get to Europe. So here we're talking about high transportation costs. These cannot be denied at all, and definitely a lot of operators would hope that they will be able to return to the region. And I did mention that not everyone did return. Some did return to the region, specifically due to, I would say, market dynamics, demand in Europe for diesel and jet fuel from India. Now, lastly, what would it take for shipping to resume? Frankly, two things. Mike mentioned earlier the issue of how some shipping companies have been, benefiting from higher freight rates and making profit actually off the Red Sea. This is one. I myself do not, and two, the high risks will definitely prevent a lot of shipping companies to return, specifically because I want to highlight this. The Houthis, for instance, they labeled some ships affiliated with MSC, which is based in Switzerland, as Israeli ships. And this is very dangerous, one, for ship, the crew on board. So I don't see them returning to the region right now, as long as the Houthis are there and posing high risks. But I want to go back to earlier what I said. The transportation costs, also these are benefiting companies. So a quick return will cause a collapse in those costs. So we need to also bear this in mind when talking about a quick resumption of shipping. I don't see us returning back to normal. There is no back to normal. This is the new normal right now, and it will be important to see how, in general, the shipping industry will address the situation, given that the current U.S. administration is taking, a different direction, and by that I mean sustained campaign against the Houthis. And I will leave it there.
Thanks. I have a number of questions from online that I will weave in here. For Liz, we have a question about what do you think will satisfy the administration? What will be sufficient to declare victory and go home? Will it be the destruction of the Houthis, the degradation of the Houthis, cries of mercy? We heard from Mike Knights about how these are hardened, highly ideological fighters who have not, have maybe not seen what we may see, but certainly experienced an awful lot and are, demonstrated themselves to be highly dedicated. So what think you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm probably not in the best position to answer. I think maybe you, having served under Trump as the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, may know that better. But look, I think that Trump has made clear, both in the previous administration and now this one, that he is a hardliner and expects sort of world leaders to bend the knee to him. I would expect that he, has that same expectation of the Houthis. Now, we have seen Trump officials come out, and the messaging has been, this campaign stops as soon as you stop threatening vessels in these shipping lanes. So maybe that is the end of it. Maybe as soon as the Houthis come out and just say, we're no longer doing this, that's the satisfaction. I expect it to be more. I expect that they will require some sort of statement from the Houthis, some sort of public admission that this will no longer continue. So, as much as the Trump team, especially at the Pentagon, I think in particular, has been clear that this has an end state, I'm just not really sure we understand what that looks like.
Yeah, one of these known unknowns, or whatever they might call them. Michael, one brief clarification for you. You spoke about the potential for more civilian collateral damage. Do we know what we've seen so far in terms of civilian casualties by the U.S. strikes?
We've had some figures put out by the Houthis. I'm trying to look for where they are on my spreadsheet here, but here's the thing, they're, first of all, it's very difficult to trust Houthi,
Yeah, so the Hamas Ministry of Health.
Yeah, and the Houthis were doing this very effectively, years and years and years ago. They know that Western public opinion and legislative opinion, even in the US, can be the weakest point to work on. In other words, they can provide the best air defense. US Congress has in the past been the Houthis' finest air defense array, and that will begin again. What we haven't really seemed to have done yet is really kill a lot of people in one go. But if and as you get more desperate to find these Houthi leaders, and if you start to, for instance, utilize signature targeting approaches, you will inevitably end up with some really ghastly incidents, because these are very packed areas. And I mean, the Saudis were tempted to do this a number of times, and it didn't work out for them, and it caused ghastly results. if we were told you have to blow up this meeting hall, but you'll get two of the top three Houthi leaders, we might take that option, as we have in the past when we blew up a whole restaurant full of people trying to kill Saddam back in 2003, and he wasn't there.
Thanks. So I've got two more questions. Noam, can you tell me, we have a question about the economic impact on Egypt, but also can you talk about what the economic impact is to date on Saudi Arabia?
Let's start with Egypt, since we haven't spoken about Egypt, and this is very important. So we already know by now that the transit through the Suez Canal is, down by over 50% compared to previous years before the maritime campaign led by the Houthis. The issue with Egypt is that it relies on tolls from transits, ship transits via Suez, and on top of that, Egypt right now is also dealing with a very high energy bill, meaning they are importing LNG. They've also been struggling with domestic oil production. So for Egypt, these are very tough times because, as I said, in addition to the high energy bill, they're also dealing with lower revenues from Suez. Is it sustainable? Of course, it's not, because you know this, David, very well. It's definitely not good for their economy. To Saudi Arabia. I want to mention two things. Earlier, I said that their flows haven't been affected by what's happening, but we need to think long term. Saudi Arabia and also the UAE, right? They have their own economic visions, like Saudi Arabia Vision 2030, and they are changing also their energy landscapes. They're coming up with new developments. Take a look at the Red Sea, for instance. Take a look at NEOM. Take a look at the massive hydrogen project they are building over there. So they have massive economic projects going on, and all this requires regional security, requires maritime security. And these are things that me and other colleagues here at the Institute, Shankar, we are keeping our eyes on. But for now, I wouldn't say, I definitely cannot compare, the economic impact on like Gulf states to Egypt. Egypt is the one that has been really hit hard.
Yeah. All right. Last question for both Mike and Liz. So Diego Garcia. Right, we have moving reportedly significant assets there. Are these assets what, B-2 bombers that can carry large penetrators? Are these for Yemen or for Iran? And if they are for Yemen, what are they gonna target? Liz, you want to go first?
I'm happy to. So look, I think we don't know quite yet, but it does include B-2s. It includes some of KC refueling aircraft. It includes some of the C-17 transport aircraft. So it's certainly a lot of assets moving into the Indo-PACOM arena, which Diego Garcia has historically been used, I think, for some of the more longer term things like Afghanistan and different missions like that. It is possible that it is for the Houthi campaign, and that they are looking to get some of the more underground areas with some of the larger munitions. It's also quite possible that the Trump administration is reading the tea leaves of, increasing tensions in the region, increasing tensions with Iran, and positioning itself to ensure that it's ready in case something else does happen. I'm sure Mike has more on that.
Yeah, thank you. Mike?
I'm such a nerd. I've spent quite a long time looking at rocks in Yemen. I've always felt that the B-2s were a bit overkill for what was required in Yemen in terms of penetrating these kind of things that have been created. I mean, it's clear that the Iranians and Lebanese Hezbollah have been teaching the Houthis how to create underground structures, and they might be reinforcing those structures internally in a way that the rock itself is not necessarily the only defense of those structures. So yeah, maybe you need B-2s to drop something big on them. I just, even when the B2 was used the first time in Yemen, to me, it looks like a capability that you're exercising publicly that the Iranians can see that you don't necessarily need for that kind of environment, but it's good practice and everybody sees it. But it's also good cover potentially for moving a bunch of B2s in place to go and, as President Trump said, you know, every weapon that's fired out of Yemen, we know is an Iranian weapon. And so maybe it is time, one of these times of the B2s being deployed, they're gonna take a right hand turn and go after you know, some of the places these weapons come out of.
Excellent. Well, listen, I think our time is up. We've covered an enormous amount of ground here, and I'm sure in the coming weeks and months we're going to be revisiting and pushing forward on these topics. There is still much to discuss. I want to thank Mike Knights, Liz Dent, and Noam right on my colleagues here at the Institute for this excellent panel, and thank you out there for joining us. And we'll see you again at the next policy forum. Thanks a lot.